Hi everyone, this is Jimmy Beach. Welcome to this exposure webinar. In the next few minutes today, we will go through taking the first steps when you're processing images using exposure. I'll touch on all the major points in the workflow. We will begin, let's begin actually. Exposure is our advanced, non-destructive raw photo editor and organizer. We can use it to copy images from camera cards, apply editing adjustments, creative effects, export finished photos, and you can even print right here from within Exposure. So, a quick history lesson about Exposure is about 15 years ago or so, a little bit more than that. Exposure was developed for film photographers. The transition from developing analog film in the darkroom with using chemistry to processing images digitally in the computer was really a tough transition to grasp for a lot of film photographers, and so Exposure's accurate film emulation presets are really what helped make that change by giving photographers the look and feel of their favorite film types. And so Exposure's accurate film emulation presets were kind of the backbone for this whole thing, and we will definitely talk about that during the demonstration today. I do want to point out that as we get into the demo, we are watching the Q&A and the chat, so feel free to ask any questions. Also, if we don't answer it during the lesson, or if we don't get to it before the end, we will reserve time for Q&A. So, without further ado, let's get going. Anyway, all right. So, ingesting images from cards. That's usually where the workflow begins. That's where you go and do your shooting. So, when you put a camera card into the computer, this dialog here will come up. And actually, we hear people say that they don't like when this dialog comes up when they insert their card into the computer. And so you can actually change that behavior inside of the Preferences panel in Exposure, just in case it would be irritating for you when you put a camera card in. So you can see right here, it's Preference. All right, let's go back there. Camera from card. There we go, or photos from card. So here we go. We have a camera card, and we'll select that here. So notice in this dialog, there are three main steps to ingest or copy these images onto the computer. So, and then we'll get into culling and editing the shoot down to the top selects. So Exposure handles a lot of different raw files. In addition to TIFF files, JPEG files, DNG files, and even Photoshop PSD files. So notice on this page, we have a number of the numbered sections across the top of the panel. We have step 1 here is select the source. So we chose our camera card. Step 2 is to review which images and select which images we want to copy. And then step 3 here is to set where we want the images to be saved. And so we'll set the destination folder here. And I want to save it here I put it inside of on my desktop, inside of a Photos folder, and then I want to name it Frank Salas because these are Frank Salas's images. And these are all just, from his camera, whatever. You can rename your images if you want to add your own flavor of naming convention. And we can also set some metadata information here below. You can see that some of this is filled out. So you can put your copyright info and your name, contact information, etc. You can also add keywords like you see here, added here. So we can add a bunch of different keywords if we want to. We can also even add our own presets from within Exposure if we want, and our favorite looks so that it will create a virtual copy of the images as they're copied. So, if you want to see like a color and a black and white look, you can set it so that you have two different presets here. Copy them to your computer, and then you have those edits already prepared for you, so you don't really need to do anything once they are copied. Anyway, I'm going to not apply metadata just for the demonstration. So we have 123 images, and they are all selected. I'm going to hit OK. Now, usually it goes really fast, so I'm going to speak before I click, and that is that there's no modules or catalogs inside of Exposure. So as the images are copying. Oh, go, 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 go. As the images are copying to the computer, you can see that it's copying right now. Thankfully, it's not going super blazingly fast. And we can see them come in this folder right here at the bottom. However, they are being copied, but I can still go in here and work on these images. So if I wanted to, while this process is still working, just move to the side here. I can go in and mark these different ones as my favorites. So I'll say I want this one's a 5-star. I can give, I can give it a flag to say this is one of my favorite photos that I want to use. I can also go in and actually apply edits here to these images, and you can see that there'll be some changes here as I make adjustments. And oh, now it's done recording, but you can see that you don't need to wait for that to finish before you begin processing your images. So in the case that you have maybe copied thousands of photos to your computer, you can begin working immediately, and you don't need to wait until that process completes, and then the other process of rendering out JPEG previews, and you know how that can go with the catalog. So you can immediately begin working on your images in Exposure, and there are no modules, so you can do all of the commands at all times inside of Exposure. So that makes this a very easy process to back up your edits, back up your images, and collaborate with other retouchers. And then there's no single point of failure. So let me actually tell you what I'm talking about here. We don't have a catalog inside of Exposure, so we just copied our images over to our desktop. It says right here on the left side, you can see in the folders panel, desktop, photos, and then Frank Salas. Those were the images we just copied. And if I bring over a Finder window, we can see on the desktop, I have a Photos folder and Frank Salas' folder right here. So we can also see that there's a folder inside there that says Exposure Software. These are your sidecar files. They're saved within the same folder of images as the originals, right? So we can, when I was talking about backups earlier, we can just go ahead and grab this whole folder and maybe copy it to Google Drive or my passport that I have attached or something like that, if we wanted to, and we have our backups of the images and all the editing information and stuff that we've put in here, including culling and virtual copies, all of that stuff. All right, so let's discuss organizing our photos. That's what we do after we move them onto our computer so that we don't edit every single one and spend a lot of extra time. We want to stay focused on the images that we know we want to use, and so that's really the next stage in the process, is trying to figure out which ones we want to keep. And so I'm going to close the right dock, and so we just see the images here. Actually, I'm going to close the left dock too. We don't need to see that right now. So we have all these photos from Frank, right? We just copied them into the image, or into the computer. We have a bunch of options that we can apply to these things to organize them. And what we're going to do is we will apply stars, flags, color labels, those three things in particular, to organize these. Now, we can also organize photos into collections, which is a different form of a folder. It's more of a virtual folder where you can have as many copies of images from different places on your computer as you'd like. And they are here in the folders panel at the bottom, are your collections. And you can see there's a bunch of them here. You can even build hierarchical collections. So within collections are collections. So, you know what I mean? You can see specific images of specific people. Oh, I disconnected that. Anyway, so you can build them in a hierarchy however you'd like to, and you can build as many as you want without filling up your computer with duplicate files. Okay, so we're going back to our folder here. That was a collections thing. Sorry for a change of subject. Back to culling our images. Let's use flags. That's usually the easiest and quick way, and that's to pick or reject, or you just leave it neutral. Down on the bottom of the screen, we can see that we have our filter right here. This is to filter by these criteria. So that's a flag, right? That's white. And then black with the X is a reject flag. And then the open flag is a neutral flag, which means we didn't do anything. So you can also see here in the grid view, if I make this a little larger, on the left side, we can see that the flag is an icon on the left. So if we click on that, it'll make it a pick flag. If you click again, makes it a reject. Click it one more time, and it sets it back to neutral. So another way that we can do that is to use the keyboard, because these little tiny things here on the screen are kind of a mess to deal with all the time. So keyboard makes things a little quicker. Plus, we'll mark it as a pick, and I will use the arrow keys to navigate through the images. So we can add plus. If you want to minus, would be a reject, and then you can see that it also makes the thumbnail dark, well, darker, so that you have that visual representation of the flag status. And to speed things up a little bit, as you run through your images to choose which ones you want to keep and which ones you don't, let's say, we'll hold the Shift button, which is a modifier. Now, instead of having to hit the arrow button to navigate between these images, as I'm doing here, I'm going to hold down Shift and I'll hit plus, and then you'll see that it automatically went to the next one. So then I can just run my way through here pretty quick and choose which of these I like and which I don't want to keep. And you can see that it's actually very, very quick. So I'm doing this in thumbnail view just so that we can make our way through these images quickly. Typically, that's where I would begin if I'm editing my own photos, just because, well, that's just me. But if I look at an image a little bit larger, then I start picking it apart too much. So especially if I have images like these two that are similar, similar shot here, I would probably start to pick apart which one of these I want, and I'd look in too much detail. So I like to stay in the thumbnail view when I go through for like the first pass of culling my images. So we also talked about stars, star ratings, and color labels. So we can use these in a bunch of different ways, but let's point out how we can apply our stars. We can do that with, you can see them at the bottom. Here, let's make that some larger again. We can do that. This is the bottom here. You can see that there are 5 little star icons, and you just click whichever one you want to give to the rating of that image. Click it again to remove it. It's that simple. And these stars here correlate with the keyboard shortcuts 1 through 5 on the keyboard. So if you hit 5, then you're going to give it a 5-star rating, and a 4 for a 4-star rating. Okay, hold down Shift while you hit one of these numbers, and you can apply stars to the images however you would like. Also, I'm mentioning some keyboard shortcuts. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize all of those things. All of the keyboard shortcuts inside of Exposure are available from the Help menu. Here on the top, you can see keyboard shortcuts is right here. Also, because I'm right here, I'm going to point out the manual. So if you ever have a question about how something works inside of Exposure, the manual is really handy. It has a bunch of links inside of it. It has descriptions of everything, all of the operations inside of Exposure, how the controls work, and there's even links to videos where you can hear, see demonstrations of how to use the different features. Okay, so the last thing that we haven't applied yet are our color labels. Now, color labels are very similar to doing the same thing with our flags and our star ratings, but a color label gives you an additional level of categorization. So I use color labels when I'm doing editing that tell myself which ones of the images I'm going to make black and white, for example, and which ones I'll leave in color. And I also change those color labels after I've done the editing to the images to show that it's completed. So let's say let's make these a little smaller. I'm going to run through here and grab a couple of shots that I like, that I think are good ones, right? And then I'm going to mark these all with a color label, and I can mark these with on the right side. If I right click, you'll see the menu here for which color I want to make them. So I'm going to make them yellow, saying that I'm going to make these black and white. And then I'll hit Command D to deselect them. You can see that now I've just selected this one image. And now you can see that I have some yellow labels here. Well, if I wanted to, let's say, print some images, I would label those with a blue label, which is a 9. So there we go. We hit 9 on the keyboard. Again, keyboard shortcuts. Very handy to mark these different images for our uses. So I would just print that one, and I would probably print the kissing shot, because there's got to be a kiss shot when you get married, right? And it's down. Oh, that's cute. See, mark it just like that. Okay. So I've been viewing them in a grid view to show you how easy it is to use in the grid view. However, we can also zoom in to view them larger, just like this. Now the same rules apply. You can still use the arrow keys to navigate your way through the batch of images or the folder of images that you have selected. And you can also apply all of the different ratings and labels, etc., 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 just like you could from the grid view. So, for example, this one, we have it labeled yellow. Let's go to the next one. This would make a good black and white shot too, so I'll make it yellow with the 7, and I can move my way through the batch. Also, when we are navigating our way through the batch or the folder of images, we can also use Shift, and that will allow us to navigate to the next image in the batch as we apply our, let's say, flags. So I'll hold down Shift and hit plus. I want to keep that one. And then that was a good one too, so I'll hit plus again. She looks like she's blinking, so I'll hit a minus. And that's all you do, is you work your way through here, just like that. And you can apply all of the different ratings and all of the different things that you'd like to organize your images quickly. So, now with that done, I'm going to hit escape. Now I go back to the grid view just like that. And then I'm going to hit tab. Oops, wrong. I'm going to hit this button and bring back the folders panel here on the left. So again, we are looking at all of the folders on the computer. So this is the desktop, and I have some more folders here. So I'm going to move to another folder in the batch, or on my computer here, and we have some images from April Milani. So we have gone through and we've learned about how we're going to organize our images. So I've moved to another batch of images or another folder of images, and we're going to talk about processing and things that we can do to process our images inside of Exposure. Okay. Now, before I begin, when you're processing your images, there are two fundamental things that you can do when you're processing images. Editing adjustments that you make to your images can be used for two things. They can be used to correct issues in a photo, like sharpening or transform or straightening, let's say. And the other way that they can be used is creatively. And so what we'll talk about first are the correcting issues edits that you'll make to your images in Exposure. Things like lens correction. So let me, I'm going to select an image here, and I'm going to open up the lens correction. Okay, so lens correction is something you do in Exposure. It's both automatic and manual, and so you can see for this image in particular, we are, excuse me, I have an outline, and I hit my outline, and it like scrolled to the other spot in my outline. Yeah, sue me. Sorry, guys. Anyway, okay, back to where we were. Lens correction, we can apply it automatically using a profile here. We see we have the camera and the model of lens. We can also add our own, we can use the profile for distortion correction or vignette correction, etc., etc. We can also turn this off if we don't want to use it, or we can set it manually if we'd like to. So you can do whatever you want inside of Exposure in terms of lens correction. Another thing that you would look at to correct issues within the photo is transform. So if you have some perspective issues, if you're shooting an image like that has some architectural like lines, if your horizon looks like it has a little bend in it or something like that, not quite right, or you want to stretch or skew, transform tool or transform panels where you would do that. Also, cropping and rotating, that's another good thing to do at the beginning. And so, for example, I will use the leveling tool here for this image, just to draw a straight line across it, and then it'll make that little tiny tweak for me to make sure that's nice and straight. And I'll hit close. Oh, actually, there's a bunch of presets in here as well, so you don't have to just rotate this image. You can also use different crop aspect ratios here that are programmed into Exposure. So if you want a square to crop to send to Instagram, you can use that there, or 16 by 9 if you're going to do like a widescreen. This would be like, you know, for the TV, or if you're going to put something on YouTube or something like that. So I'm going to leave it original and then make it bigger again. Hey, that was a spam call. Sorry, everyone. and close. Okay, so now we have that transform, or that rotation happening. Also, at the beginning of the workflow, I also take a look at sharpening. And so that would be another thing that I would say we're making corrections to the image rather than we are creative adjustments to the image. So we have sharpening and noise reduction. I'd put both of those on the making corrections to the image. So this one's pretty sharp, but we're going to add a little bit of sharpening as well. So it has a lot of punch when you're looking at it at full screen view. So in the sharpening panel, I will add a bit of sharpening here, way too much, just so that we can make sure that we can see what's going on the screen. Sometimes sharpening is difficult to see, but I'll show you how. So we'll adjust the amount just really high temporarily, knowing that we're going to probably reduce that in a bit. And then I'm going to set the radius of sharpening. Now, if you're not familiar with how sharpening works, the radius is how wide the sharpening effect will show on the image. So I'm going to hold the Alt key in exposure, and then it will change my view to this black and white image. And then you can see as I drag the radius wider, look at the balloon, for example, all the way on wide, you can see that there's blooming happening around the balloon here. So I'll hold that again. I'm still holding Alt. So you can see that there's like a lightning effect happening in the middle where it's muddy, and then on the outside there's some extra oomph added to the silhouette of that balloon. Okay, so that's way too much. I'm going to take that down because all I want to do is sharpen those little tiny bits of that so that you know, just on the subject here, that's what's going to pop. So I'll say the adjustment right there. Hopefully you can see this through the video. Sometimes that's hard to see. Now, detail has something this can pull out at higher levels. Detail can add some like noise almost, or some crunchiness. Crunchiness really isn't a word, but hey, I'm using this. You can use this to add a little bit of, it can emphasize noise, especially at higher levels. I don't think we really need it for this image because there's not really an overlaying amount of noise. So, but this is needed. If there is a noisy image, you might need that to have this sharpening not look completely out of place. And then the masking is going to tell us how much, it's controlling how much contrast there needs to be between light and dark values to apply the sharpening effect. And so now with that said, I'm going to hold the Alt button and do the same slider or control change, and you'll see it on the screen. So right now, everything's selected. And so I want to make it so that it has to have more contrast. So if I drag that over, you can see which edges are being selected for the adjustment, and it almost looks like we have what we want right here when it's way up there. Just the subject and his balloon are going to get sharpening when we have the masking set that high. So now we still have it creamed with a ton of sharpening, and you can see that it does look like he has a bunch of, well, he looks like he has an edge around him. So we don't want that to be that strong, so we'll turn that back down. There. So now we have just the right amount of sharpening. Sharpening lesson. All right. So noise reduction, this image doesn't really have a lot of noise reduction in the first place. And so I'm not going to apply any, but noise reduction would be another step in the process of correcting issues with the photo. So now that we've done that, we get to talk about the cool, creative editing, fun stuff. Okay, so let's find another, I'll click on another image here. This one's pretty. I love the color on this one. Okay, so with a new image, let's talk about the presets. That's really where exposure began. So exposure's rendering engine. I'm going to close the folders panel and open the presets panel. So exposure really began with this presets, or with these presets. So its rendering engine was built to accurately emulate film, even down to the little subtle details of individual grain clusters, etc., etc. And the presets in exposure, cover a variety of iconic film looks. And so if you haven't used exposure before, I would encourage you that you would spend some time looking through the different film stocks and looks available. They're gorgeous. They really are. And they're not overdone. You can go through ones that are more subtle, like they're organized into folders. So you can go through ones that are more subtle, like these color films. Even more subtle would be the low contrast color film looks. You can see that even by hovering over the thumbnails here on the left, you can see as they apply to the image, it's just a little tiny bit of adjustment every once in a while. These low contrast versions are really good for skin, so they make skin look healthy. And because they're low contrast, you won't add a lot of texture or anything to the skin itself. So that's a good place to start with that. The slide films are a little bit more colorful, a little bit more punchy, and that's just by nature as to how they do. So, Fuji Velvia, this is like the landscape, the punchiest, most colorful landscape film at the time, or available for such a long time. It's gorgeous. Really, really good looking preset. So I'm just going to select that, and then it applies to the image. So now I want to take your attention over to the Layers panel over here on the right side. We can see that our layer has Fuji Velvia 50, which tells us that we have applied our preset. Now we can apply multiple presets if we want to inside of exposure. So let's grab another one. You can make and create your own looks here. So I'm going to grab this blue faded darker one, and I'm going to drag it up on Add Layer. And now I have 2 presets on 2 different layers. So now I can take whichever layer I want and make that blend with this other layer below it to create a completely new look. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I just wanted to show that you don't just need to use one of the presets alone, but you can mix it up and change it and make your own look really easily with exposure. I'm going to delete that layer just so that we don't get confused there. All right, so now we have some presets here. So we've only looked through the color ones. There's a whole slew of black and white presets that you can use as well. And these are completely gorgeous on, any kind of photos. I love black and white photos. Anyway, you can also mark your own favorites and create your own and save them here, and they'll be under the user presets. Okay, so you can go back to all just so we can pick them. All right, now I'm going to close that dock. So now let's talk about when you're making adjustments to our fundamental adjustments to our images. You can get as detailed as you like when you're making creative adjustments to your photos. You can just do a handful of adjustments quickly if that's all the photo needs, or you can spend a heck of a long time, even several minutes, hours even, perfecting this image to make sure that everything inside of them reads just the way that you want to. So that's really up to you. Let's open the basic panel. This is kind of when you're making creative adjustments. This is kind of the first place you'll go. So the first thing I'm going to point out are the auto adjustments. It's right at the top of the panel. Okay, so I have that preset applied up here. I'm going to reset this image just so it's back to what it was before, and then I'll hit auto again. Okay, so I hit auto, and then you can see here that it's applied some adjustments to this image. Now these are intelligent adjustments. I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to filter out. There we go. Let's just look at those green. I said the green filter. So all of these were marked with the green color label. Okay, so I'm going to select all of these, and then I'm going to apply my auto adjustments. So auto adjustments are intelligent adjustments. They will not apply the same exact adjustment to each one of these photos because it needs to look at the photo, analyze it, and then apply the adjustment. So that's what just happened there. Now, you set your automatic adjustments up at the beginning, when you first start to use exposure, so sometimes it takes a little bit of experimentation to get it right. Inside of the you click the icon next to auto to open up the more detailed controls of it. So I'm going to raise the exposure bias one, which is the overall value of exposure that you're telling the computer to set, and I want to make it a little brighter. Okay, and that's it. So I've set these up just because this is the way I like them when I'm editing an exposure, but you can do that however you'd like to. So now that I've set that, I'm going to reset all these images, and hit auto again. All right, so you can see that they're a little brighter now. I like that. It looks better on my screen. Okay, so we'll talk about the basic panel here real quick. So I'm going to open up an image here. So inside the basic panel, these are when you're making adjustments. I would say basic adjustments, but that's kind of redundant. So here on the basic panel is where we make essential adjustments, but a lot of these were covered by our automatic adjustments that we just applied. However, when you're dialing these in, try to follow an order where you begin at the top of the panel and then you work your way down. Now, you don't need to work every single panel in order of succession, but when you do work inside of a panel, just remember that you follow that same kind of order. Reason for that being is that the exposure value, for example, controls all of the tones inside of this image. Okay, whereas the highlights does not. It only controls a smaller group or a smaller area of those tones. Okay, so now that we've made some adjustments, if I'm going to make tweaks to this, I'm going to begin at the top here with the exposure slider. Then I would make a little bit of adjusts to contrast and work my way down through the list. I think this looks pretty good the way that it is. So I'm just going to close the basic panel. The next panel I would go to is probably the color panel. There's a lot of controls here that you can control the way colors behave inside of your images. You can do quick, simple things like adding a little bit of a cool tone or a warmer tone to an image here. We can also add different color filter looks to the image. These are actually very useful in black and white photography as well. We can get into more detailed adjustments in the color with these sliders below. So we have hue, saturation, and luminance controls. The hue controls adjust the hue values. So let me show you exactly for what I'm talking about here. So I will talk about the reds. So I can make the reds in the image more, what would this be? More magenta. If you see here by the roses, look very magenta now. Or I can make them more orange. You can see how they're changing there. And all I'm doing is making an adjustment to that reds channel to do that. I actually kind of like that little purple tone to the bottom there, so I'll add a little bit of that. Saturation, obviously, is how saturated those colors are in the image. Now, there's some really fancy things that we can do on this, in the saturation of these colors. We can grab the midtones, for example, and reduce the midtones. If we wanted to give this more of a old-fashioned vintage look, you can reduce the saturation in the midtones. Also, what we can do here is, let's say I want to use the color or the this selector tool, the saturation selector tool. So I'm going to select the color of the dress here, for example, and then I'm going to drag down. So rather than needing to adjust both the reds and oranges sliders here, I'm just doing that both at the same time to reduce the saturation in the dress just a little bit. I think that that's going to help the flowers here punch up a little bit. Now, I'm still inside this tool and I'm still adjusting saturation, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the greens of the stem and I'm going to make those a little bit more saturated. You see what's happening? There we go. Beautiful. Okay, cool. So now I can close that tool. Luminance controls how bright the different values are. And so I'm going to grab my reds because I made a tweak earlier, and I want to make those reds just a little bit brighter to make those flowers stand out. And we can see really quickly that we can adjust the colors inside of this photo easily with the controls in the color panel. I'm going to turn off and on the color panel controls so that we can see what differences we made to this photo. Now, it was pretty subtle and pretty quick for us to make those tweaks, but we can see that it reads a little bit more clear, especially with the flowers, you know, and how they're popping off there. Yeah, it is upside down. It's supposed to be upside down. Also, if you do have an image that does come in upside down, you can rotate it right here. Yeah, it's not as cool. Turn it back around. There we go. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the tone curve panel. Now, the tone curve panel is another way that you can adjust controls or control tones in the image. Tone curve panel's right here. So if you use the tone curve panel, if you use the what is this thing called here? Curve editor in Photoshop or Lightroom, you'll feel right at home. This is just about the exact same thing. There are presets inside of all of the panels inside of exposure, and the presets enable you to select from, commonly used, in this case, curves. And so we can brighten the highlights or crush the blacks or do a bunch of different stuff here. You can also flip it, invert it, or you can give it milky blacks, which you can see that gives it a little bit of a raised gray look in the black tones. If you use the color editor, then you can add and move to your points along the curve here easily to make manipulations or changes to the way that this image is looking, or you can just remove that extra point there just by dragging off of the graph. There we go. Okay, and you can also use the sliders down here below. Instead of using just points on the graph or on the line here, we can use the sliders, and you can see that it gives you a dotted line. So that dotted line is from the slider, where you can make adjustments with the curve itself, and then refinements with the slider. Okay, down below are split toning, and there's a bunch of presets for split toning. Split toning is a great way to add some coloring separately to the highlights and the shadows on images, which plays up a lot of color theory and can make it very punchy and cool looking. There's a whole bunch of them for black and white images, where normally this is done with chemistry in the darkroom, but there are some color options as well. And so we can see that they added a little bit of a look here. And these are fully adjustable as well, or customizable, so you can drag them and change where you want the color to apply on the image. You can change what color you want to apply and how strong it is pretty easily. So that's up to you. Split toning. So we'll close the tone curve panel. So now let's talk about a couple more creative effects panels. So we haven't talked about the spot heal tool, and we haven't talked about the clone tool. So let's look at that now. So spot heal. So every once in a while you'll have something in an image that irritates you somehow and is a distraction. And so we have the clone and heal tools available here. Now the heal tool is better suited to help with fixing issues inside of a field or inside of on skin, right? Whereas the clone tool, if we have texture like lines between black or the shadow and light, then the clone tool might be a little bit better suited for it. So after you make a spot in exposure, you can then continue to make adjustments to that spot, as you can see it updating as I make these tweaks. So you can make it work with the image however you want, or add more feathering or less, and you can even turn the opacity up or down if you, for example, if you don't want to take something completely out because it's part of the texture, but it was just a little distracting, just like that. So that's the spot heal tool. That thing's all gone. All right, I want to make sure that I'm touching on everything, so I'm just going to double check where I'm at. Okay, so cool. This image, let's choose another image. This one's cute. All right. So let's talk about Vignette. Vignette's a great way to draw attention to your subject, and in exposure, there's, again, lots of presets that you can choose from. Now, inside of exposure, it's really easy for you to make a vignette that has an analog look and feel to it. So I'll show you how. I'm going to just drag the amount all the way up so we can see it as bright or as dark as it can. I'm going to turn the softness off. Now we can see that, the shape of this is kind of oblong and strange, and that's because of these two sliders on the bottom, distortion and lump size. So we can distort the shape of our vignette, and we can control the size of the lumps that are used to distort the vignette. Now we can also change where the location of the vignette is going to go on the image, and we can randomly apply our distortion and lumps to the image to make that distortion. Now after clicking this a few times, usually I'll find something that I think I like, and then make a couple of more adjustments. So now that I have this in a shape that I think will look well or look good for this image, now I'll add my softness back in. And then I can take the, hang on a sec. Now I'll take the amount and turn that back way down because it was super strong. So now I can just turn this panel off and on. You can see that vignette effect drawing you right into the middle. And it's very organic. This looks like it looks like it was natural. So another way that you can draw attention to the subject is with the Bokeh panel. I pronounced it Bokeh for years and years, and then was corrected that it was bokeh, so don't judge. I had no idea. But it's a Japanese word it talks about the quality of the out-of-focus areas of the photo. So inside the Bokeh panel, we can add blurring. We can add the blurring that is that matches this this lens, for example, so the Canon 85 f1.2, this is about what the behavior of that bokeh would look like, and so we can control that to place it wherever we want to add a focus to an area in the image. Now, this effect is very strong, and that's good so that we can see it, but I'm going to make it much more subtle. So if you see how the edge of the blurring, let me zoom in, you can see how the edge of this blur effect is just barely starting on the outside of our subject here. I don't want to blur him out, too much, just something subtle. So I'll just drag this focus region, is what this is called. Now you can use a couple of different focus regions inside of the bokeh panel. And so this is just one of them. This was the radial region. And now I'll drag the amount down so that it's just barely noticeable. There we go. So that is the bokeh panel. I'll turn it off and on, and you can see the edge here and what that condition changes and what it looks like. Boop. It's super subtle. Maybe I should make that stronger. Okay, now you can see it. Anyway, that's a really good way to draw attention to the subject too. Let's talk about grain real quick. We're almost to the end of our demonstration, guys, so bear with me. On the grain panel, exposure's grain is really second to none. It has more controls for grain, placement of grain, the behavior of grain than you can find in other software. So we can just choose a normal old grain look. I'll find one that's really crunchy so we can see it on the image here. So way too strong. You can see it here in the shadows. But we can also control where it goes. So I'll take the amount in the shadows here, and I'm going to drag that down because it's reading very, very strong in those shadows. Also, I can see it here in the midtones where it's reading really strong, so I can turn that down as well. But the highlights, I don't hardly see any, so I can just raise that if I want. So now the grain look, you can see that even though it's completely way too strong, we still see where it's coming across this photo, and we have good control over where it's going to be. So we can also add more roughness or color variation to the way the grain behaves, and we can even change the size of that grain and the behavior of that grain. So I'm going to turn the grain strength down now that I've had it way too cranked, just to make it more subtle and give you that subtle, almost film-like look without appearing like a bunch of noise. So let's talk about overlays. Overlays are a great way to add some interest to an image when it's needed. And so they're completely customizable. And so we have 3 different ways that you can apply overlays and exposure, and that is a border that goes all the way around the outside of the image, a light effect, which adds interesting artifacts over the top of the image, and and that's in its location, and then a texture, which goes kind of across the whole image and adds an effect across the entire image. Now, we can always protect a location in the image from all of these effects so that if we do place texture, it doesn't go, let's say, on the subject here in the center. We can do that with our protect location, or we can also add a light or add an effect. We click on the thing, there we go. We can add an effect like, well, there's tons of them to choose from, and they're totally customizable, so we can add any of these to our image. Now, I have a rule of thumb, that's just me personally, is that I don't usually use an effect that adds a color to an image that it doesn't already have. That's just me, but I've seen them and they look really good, and so now I want to experiment with it personally. So anyway, I'm probably going to totally change the way I recommend stuff. Anyway, we can totally change how this applies to the image. Let's make it really easy to see. Okay. We can change how it applies to the image. We can move it around a little bit, make it larger, so the way that it affects the image is bigger. And we can also change what blend mode it has if we want to punch up certain colors or something like that. So there's a bunch of options that we have here to make this look however we want it to. I find that I like these very subtle, but they look really good when they're really subtle. Okay, so we've talked about overlays too. So now's a great time for us to talk about layers. I remember we talked about layers earlier in the demonstration, and so we should probably talk more about that now. We have a whole bunch of effects that we have applied on this first layer. So I'm going to hover my cursor over the thumbnail, and then you can see it has listed all of the adjustments that I've made to the image on that layer right here. So we have the bokeh panel on the bottom, the grain panel, we had some adjustments, overlays, vignette, and the basic panel. Okay, so we have all those tweaks made. Now if I add a different layer, I can control the opacity, of all of the adjustments I made on this layer. But let's say I want to add one of my creative effect presets over the top of this because I think it would look cool. So I will find a colorful one. Yeah, let's do a really colorful one. Okay. Boop. Okay, so I have my image looking like this, and I'm going to apply one of these presets, but I don't want to overwrite all the adjustments I just made. You can see them here with these little circular arrows that go like that. That means if I click there, it will reset this panel. So these are all the adjustments I made. I don't want to reset them. What I want to do instead is apply this in a new layer. So before I clicked on a preset and I drug it over to here where it said add layer. But you can add layer just like that, and then you can click on the preset to apply it. Okay? And let's say we don't like that one, we can change to another one. And it'll update because we have our new layer. Okay? I think I want something with blue. Let's find something with blue. Let me search blue. Woo! See, there's blue ones. So I'm going to add a black and white look. These are black and white. That's cool. All right, so I'm going to... Now, this actually, I'm glad that I selected a black and white look. A black and white look can be difficult to work with, but that's just because a black and white look has something that you need to keep in mind, and that's called the blend base. So let me explain. If I take the opacity slider and I drag that down, you can see that the blue, the cyan of the preset that we applied, it goes away, and now it's just a black and white image. So that's because our blend base right here on the top, whenever you have a black and white layer, see it says black and white here on the basic panel. Black and white layer, or black and white blend base, means that when the opacity of this goes down to 0, then it's just a black and white image. When the opacity of this is 100%, then you see the preset. If we change this to color, then as I move my opacity lower, then the original coloring of the image comes through on the bottom instead of it mixing with a black and white version of that image. So that's why I was going to use this little tone here, just to add a little bluing. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So now we can control these individually and make it a little bit quicker and easier. Okay, so this is a preset that we applied to the entire image, this black and white cyanotype preset. So let's look at how we can control where this preset is applied to this image. Right now it's across the entire thing. I'll take the opacity all the way back up. Okay? If I click the mask, that's this white thumbnail to the right, you can see if I select, or if I hover over the mask, then it highlights the area of the image that the mask is selecting. Okay? So we can control this mask in a number of different ways. We can use the brush. You can see I'm in the brush panel right now. So I can add some brushing, which will tell exposure I want to apply this preset to this image or this area in the middle that I just drew here. I'm going to reset that. Okay, so now it's black. This thumbnail, my layer thumbnail, or my mask thumbnail, excuse me, it's black. And I don't have that preset applied. See how it's not there? So now when I go to brush, it's going to be where I tell it, right? So instead of using the brush, I can also use gradients. That's very similar to the controls in the bokeh panel. So I can add a gradient, and then I can control this gradient with where I want that natural seamless fade to happen. If I want to apply a look similar like this, It'll allow me to control that in a very, like, you know, you can have a very soft look there. I'll delete that. So we're back to a black mask. Another thing that we can do instead of using a gradient is we can use the color constraints, and that uses the image information to create a mask for us. So we can use the hue, saturation, and luminance. Remember those things from the color panel. We can use those values for colors in this image to create our mask for us. And so let's select the skin tones, okay? So I'm going to use the little eyedropper here and go over onto the image and select a middle tone on his skin. Now I know that they're going to share some of those tones with the background because it's wood, and he shares some of those tones with the oranges too because they're orange. Anyway, but we can show mask so we can see where it's being applied. And this is automatically selecting this image. So we can also make some further controls to tell exposure where to make that selection, you see. So we can drag these down and say, no, we don't want the oranges because they're too saturated. We only want, you know, everything that's not very saturated type thing. Or we can go use the luminance and say, well, we don't want anything that's really dark. We only want the bright values. Yeah. So you can see that I'm just going to apply it on the skin there. Right? And then we can suppress some noise here and add a little bit of feathering too, so that our selection's a little bit nicer, a little cleaner. Right? So now you can see, obviously, the adjustment that we put on there is way too strong, so we need to turn that way down. But adding this little tiny bit of cyanotype toning to this the highlights on this really kind of draw that out, that blue tone on this warm image, really pulls it out and adds punch to it in terms of color. Okay, cool. So we've shown that we can do a couple of different things where we've made some layers and we've made some adjustments with layers. So we can add a different layer here. Let's say that we wanted to do an overlay. We can add an overlay here and another layer. And ooh, yeah, that one. Okay. So we'll make that big. And oh, come on. Here we go. Okay, you can see I'm blocking it out, so it's protecting it from him. And we'll go up here. So now we have control over the opacity of just this layer, or just where it's applying to him. You can see it just like that. So now I have the look that's down, you know, that I have control over that individually. I have control over the look on his highlights individually. And then I have all of the rest of the adjustments made on their own layer at the bottom of the stack. Okay? So it's really easy to build up these creative looks inside of exposure. That's really where the point of me trying to make this in this demo is just that it's easy to build up layered looks and have more control over those effects later in editing. All right, so we've made a whole bunch of edits to our images. And I remember talking about that exposure remembers all of those. And you can see here inside of the history panel all of the steps that we made to create this look. So it's going to re-render each one of these as I select or hover over it, and we're just stepping backwards in our workflow here. You know, and we can step backwards and forwards. Also, this history is remembered. In our folder, in our Finder window here, we can see on the desktop in our Photos folder, here's April's folder and the exposure software. These sidecar files right here contain all the information that we just applied here in these images. So if we wanted to back this up, we can just take this whole folder and drag it right over onto our passport, make a backup copy, and we have all of our edits and history and everything saved right there. So that is pretty much where we're, oh, also I didn't mention collaboration. So here we are again with our Finder window. If we were collaborating with somebody else and wanted to have someone work on images and us work on those same images, we can take this entire folder here and copy it to like iCloud or the Dropbox folder. And as long as both computers are syncing that Dropbox folder, for example, then all of the edits and images and everything are shared between those computers. So if you make an update on one computer, then it will update on the other computer. All right. So now, as we are we made some final adjustments here to these images. Let's say that we're completely done editing. We're going to export them. So I'll just select all of them. We have 6 images here. And we'll talk about exporting. So exporting is very similar to when we were ingesting images or copying them from our cards, in that you set the destination where you want it to be. So we'll just set it on the desktop. We can create subfolders for our images if we want to. We can change the name of our images as they are being exported. So we can, let's make this. There we go. And we can also add a, let's say, sequence number. And we'll reset that to, whoop, okay. So there, now we'll have our images, and they will have nice fancy names and look really pretty in our folder. And we can also we can tell it what the file settings are for the images that we're exporting here. Metadata, if we want to include any, or if we want to include none, or if we want to add a watermark or whatnot. And we can tell it how big our final images need to be here on the end. So after we have all these set and we set export, I'm not going to, but after we hit export, then these 6 images will be exported to our desktop with their respective names, etc. One step better is to use the quick export in Exposure. Quick export is a little bit quicker. That's why we named it quick export. Anyway, so quick export is found just in the file dialog, just like the export, export is. Quick export enables you to export a recipe. And so similar to how inside of the export dialog you had to set up where it was going, what the name was, what the file settings, if it was large, small, etc., metadata information, and the image size at the end, you had to tell Exposure all of those qualities for the images that you were exporting. The quick export dialog enables you to select multiple recipes to export all at once. So for Facebook, we're going to export to our folder on the desktop, export folder for Facebook. For Twitter, it's going to be the same thing, but it's going to be on the desktop in the export folder, but a Twitter folder. Instagram is an Instagram folder. You guys are following me, I'm hoping. And then the metadata that we're leaving connected to those images, and these are the sizes that we're exporting those images to. And then when we hit export, in this instance, instead of just exporting these 6 images that we have selected, you can see here on the screen, we are exporting 24 images, which enables us to kill 4 birds with 1 stone, or whatever that term is. So that concludes our demonstration in using Exposure. And so usually I turn our attention over to answering questions right now, so I'm going to give you guys a couple of comments, and then we'll shut down the recording and get over to the Q&A. If you would like to get in contact with the other Exposure users, we would love for you to. The best way to do that is over in our Facebook group, the Exposure user group on Facebook. You can post your work in there, you can ask questions, or you can post about the favorite things that you've found inside of the product. We love to see people posting images over there and talking about their workflow. Also, if you want to share your work with us and other Exposure users, we encourage you to do that over on Instagram and to include our hashtag #MyExposureEdit. So again, we wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today and for your interest in Exposure.